We are back with another episode of China in the News, conversation with Professor Doug Guthrie. Each week, we break down the biggest headlines about China and delve into their impact on business and geopolitics. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. We love to hear what topics you want us to cover next. Doug, how are you doing?
Christy, it's so great to see you. So happy to continue our conversations. As you know, I love talking about China and U.S.-China relations, but I am especially loving talking about them with you. So let's go.
Awesome. Today, we're diving into a story close to Doug and me since we both worked at Apple. Tim Cook made his third trip to China last week, and he's meeting with Premier Li Qiang. They talked about trade and supply chain, but this visit feels different. It's the first high-level meeting between foreign business leaders and a senior Beijing official since Trump won re-election. And tensions are running high. U.S. companies, including Apple, are bracing for higher tariffs under President-elect's proposed trade. So let me start with this. Why is Tim Cook's visit to China such a big deal right now?
So thank you for the question, Christine. And again, you sort of laid out the issues, which are we are in the shadow of the Trump presidency. And so this is a really critical time to think about what's happening. And we've been in this period for the last 8 years where, as you know, I often talk about the idea that U.S.-China relations, I think, are at the lowest point that they've been in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, we did the engagement policy under President Clinton, and things seemed to get better and better over the next 2-3 decades. And then in 2016, we had President Trump come in, and things got very tense. And right now, they seem at a nadir. And so we have to really think deeply about these issues. But the key thing to answer your question is we have to think deeply about these issues because U.S.-China relations are critical for the global political economy. And they are not just critical for global political economy because we're the two largest economies in the world and the first and the third trading partners of the world, but they're critical because major companies like Apple, Tesla, and Walmart depend heavily on China. We are married to China. There is no delinking and just telling the manufacturing supply chains to go elsewhere. We're here and we have to continue to develop these relationships. And so given all of the tensions that have happened over the last 8 years and given the new election and given the appointment of China hawks like Marco Rubio and Matt Waltz, people like Tim Cook need to think deeply about, okay, well, what is our relationship with China and how do we continue to show up in a way that shows we're partners with China, we're here. And so I think this trip, given it's an interesting point, I think you maybe made this point in your question, Christine, but I just want to reemphasize it for our watchers. This is Tim Cook's third trip in 2024. That's a big thing. Like the fact that a CEO as powerful as Tim Cook is heading to China 3 times in 1 year to show up when the Chinese government wants him to show up, it says something about his commitment to China.
You mentioned Apple is married to China, but isn't Apple building factories or having talks on build factories in India and Vietnam? So is it still that reliant on Apple?
So here's my favorite statistic, and you've heard me say this statistic before, Christine, but I'll say it for our audience. And I just checked the statistic on this just to make sure I'm right, and they're always moving a little bit. So Apple produces about 28% of the smartphone market share in the world, right? So 28% of people in the world who have smartphones have iPhones, right? What percentage of the profits does it take? It takes about 85% of the profits in this segment, right? So think about that. Less than a third of the smartphone market share, nearly 90% of the profits in that world. Why? The reason, and this has to do with, I'm very committed to this story and this issue because I worked very closely with the Apple operations team and with the leaders of Apple in helping China understand what we were doing in China. And so the reason is because Apple has, for the last 25 years, 23 years, Apple entered China in 2001. But since that time, Tim Cook as an operations specialist, and then Jeff Williams as the operations person who took over for Tim Cook as the COO after Tim Cook became CEO. These people are experts in how to build efficient manufacturing supply chains. And so they spent time working very closely with their Chinese suppliers on how to build efficient supply lines, right? And they built these efficient supply lines by embedding their operations specialists in their suppliers when they were producing, when there was a spike in iPhone production or a spike in any production, any component production, and they would embed these operations specialists in these spaces. So people often think of Apple being the most innovative company in the world because of its product innovation. It's also the most innovative company in the world because of its supply chain management innovation, right? And so this became very, very valuable knowledge for Chinese suppliers. And so what happens is there are these industrial clusters that would be built up around different components. And remember, an iPhone is not just final assembly. So Foxconn is final assembly, but an iPhone has hundreds and hundreds of components, right? And these components are all made at different suppliers. And so every supplier has an industrial cluster surrounded that, and they'll compete for Apple attention, right? And so what happens is that when a spike in production is coming because of a launch of a new phone, all of those suppliers of all of those components will vie for Apple attention so that they can build an efficient manufacturing supply line. And they will usually work with Apple for zero margin, right? And this is the amazing statistic. This is the reason Apple takes 28% of the smartphone market share in the world, but 85% of the profits in the world. Because
I thought Walmart was harsh on their vendors.
no,
Apple rivals that.
I have been with Apple suppliers and I've interviewed many of them, and they would often say, like, Doug, can't you convince Jeff Williams or Tim Cook to let us just have 1%? And I would say, don't work with Apple. Like, just say no. And they would say, no, we have to. And I would say,
I
why?
love how you said
Because it makes us so efficient to be with them that we can go make our money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and everybody else. And so that's the model.
when I took your Apple in China class back at Apple, you mentioned about lens technology and how she single-handedly built out because of Apple's contribution, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Like, she built at her school.
Zhou Chunfei is one of the richest people in China. She's the richest woman in China, and she is a tremendous innovator. But because of her relationship with Apple and the ways in which she, I mean, there's a famous story where Jeff Williams, when they had to build touchscreen glass and figure out how to scale the production, Jeff Williams got on a plane and flew over and spent a month in the factory with Zhou Chunfei, and they just built an efficient manufacturing supply line. And so this tacit knowledge that Apple is passing on to Chinese suppliers that has really become this partnership and this link. And it's the reason Apple gets to operate in China with suppliers making zero margins. But it can't get that anywhere else. Like, that's not going to happen in India. It could happen in India 20 years from now, but it will take 20 years to build that complex of a manufacturing supply line. And so
That makes sense.
Apple is married to China.
So as trade tension escalate, how should or how are other US companies other than China, Apple, navigating their relationship with Beijing?
So, I can't speak for all companies in terms of how they're navigating this. I can speak for a little bit about Apple because I know that case very well, and I can speak about some other companies that I've given some advisory work to. But the key thing is everybody right now needs to show that they are partners with the Chinese administration, right? And this is not just the Chinese central administration, but it's also Chinese local governments, right? And so these are provincial and city level governments. These are places like Zhengzhou and Chuzhou and Changshu and like many, many different cities in China, because they need to show that they are actually committed to China, right? And so that's really where the thing gets difficult when people say, like, well, we'll just put a 60% tariff on China, and, if iPhones raise in price 60%, they can go produce their iPhones in India. It doesn't work like that. right? Yes, Foxconn does have a final assembly plant in Chennai. And so components can be sent to Foxconn in Chennai and they can be produced there and then exported to the United States. But that's a very complex process in and of itself because you're sending hundreds of components over the borders and they have to go through India and China borders are complex. And so the system that it works really well is an integrated supply chain system, right? And so in the case of Apple, they're married to China, as we've just discussed. In the case of Tesla, Tesla is a little bit more diversified because Tesla has very complex manufacturing supply chains in China and very complex organizational structures in China and very complex organizational relationships in China, but it also has a manufacturing infrastructure in the United States, right? So Tesla is another player and they're in, maybe a better situation than Apple because they have a diversified manufacturing supply chain. Walmart, a huge percentage. I don't know exactly the percentage, but it's near 100% of their manufacturing happens in China, right? They're the single largest exporter from Walmart or from China to the United States. And so like here again, like if we were going to diversify these manufacturing supply chains and just tariffs on China would then push companies to either produce in the United States, which they won't because we don't have the manufacturing supply chains, or produce in other countries. Other countries, it takes time to develop those manufacturing supply chains as well. So again, I think we're very married to China. And so to answer your question, what a lot of companies are doing is they're hearing what's going on with the Trump administration. And then they're going to the Chinese administration, to Li Qiang, which is where Tim Cook was, Rio Tinto and other companies were there. And they're saying like, guys, we're here. We're here with you. We're your partners. And so it's a little bit of a strange dynamic because you have the US government saying like, we're raising the bar and we're creating tension and we are maybe driving manufacturing, supplying out to other countries. And then you have CEOs of major companies like Apple and Rio Tinto, probably not Tesla because Elon Musk is, in the back pocket of Donald Trump right now, but they're going to Li Qiang and they're saying, guys, we're with you. We're part of Team China. We're here.
Could you tell me a little bit about Shanghai's Lijiang Free Trade Zone? I know that Tesla entered China in 2019 and built a gigafactory there. Tell me a little bit about Lijiang Free Trade Zone in Shanghai.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting case, and I love the Tesla case. I mean, years ago, the most interesting case in the automobile industry was GM, and so GM's, I think, big joint venture in Shanghai was in 1997, and so that sort of, it's decades old and it's been there, and GM has sort of, I think, become less important in the production of China. But Tesla, um, in maybe 3 or 4 years ago, their biggest joint venture in the world was, well, I shouldn't say their biggest joint venture. Their biggest venture in the world was in China, but they were the first automobile company that was allowed to set up operations in China without a joint venture. Now, it used to be the case that if you want to be in China and have a major manufacturing hub, you have to set up a joint venture and transfer technology. And so remember, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but the WTO made it illegal to have a quid pro quo for market access. So China couldn't demand that you had a joint venture if you wanted access to the market. But the automobile industry was always sort of a safety space because just the government had such control over it. And so the interesting thing about the General Motors case, it was the first case that wasn't reporting up to the Ministry of Automotive Industries. It reported to the Ministry of Commerce or the Bureau of Commerce in Shanghai, right? So it was a localized one, and it was a big deal back when that happened. The case of Tesla also went directly to Shanghai, but it was the first automobile case where they didn't have to set up a joint venture. And my guess, Christine, and I wasn't in on the Tesla negotiations, but I was there with, watching what was happening with Apple, was my guess is that all of the information that was coming out about Apple's passing of tacit knowledge onto its supply chain partners in China is what Tesla used to make the case that they didn't need a joint venture because you can still pass tacit knowledge without having a joint venture and a formal declaration of the transfer of technology.
So
my
would you say that's a key lesson that other US tech giant can take from Apple is transfer of tacit knowledge? Yeah.
Yeah. So the yes, and again, I was there when we were making this argument to the Chinese government when we were making the case about Apple, is that this wasn't just a source of cheap labor. We were embedding people from our operations, manufacturing, supply chain into Chinese factories and helping them learn how to be efficient leaders. And so we made the case to the Chinese government at that time that we're passing tacit knowledge, and that tacit knowledge is as valuable as technology transfer. And so that's the thing that I think has been the big swing in this, is that it used to be the case that you signed a joint venture contract and you had to show exactly what technology you're transferring. Now, and I think this is because of Apple's leadership, and my guess is that Tesla negotiated a similar thing, is that now the case is if you make clear that you're teaching, you're passing tacit knowledge on how to run an efficient manufacturing supply chain, you're okay. And so that's my guess, is that what everybody's showing up to do is to ensure Li Qiang that they're helping China get better and more efficient.
Okay, my final question, the big one is after Tim Cook's visit, what should we be watching for next?
So it's a great question because, again, I think we're at a really critical moment in terms of thinking about US China relations and where we are and what the key decision points are. But I will give you not just one thing that we're thinking about next, but two things, Christine. The first is I want to see US China relations continue along an engagement path, right? And so that engagement path needs to not just be CEOs like Tim Cook flying over and seeing Li Qiang, but it needs to be local government officials in places like Phoenix, right? And Phoenix, I don't know if people in our viewership know, but Phoenix's sister city is Chengdu, right? And Tempe, which is the heart of Arizona State University, that sister city is Zhenjiang, right? And so what I want to see is local government officials getting together to really think deeply about how they're describing transformation and transition of knowledge. Just last night, I was on a call with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and it was with a Chinese airplane company that wants to figure out how to invest in manufacturing, in building their airplanes in Arizona, and then also teaching of things. And, it was a little odd that I was on the call because I don't know anything about manufacturing of airplanes or about teaching flying, but that's what they wanted. They wanted Professor Guthrie to talk to them about what's Arizona like. And so I think these local connections are really, really important. The second thing is I just think we need to really push back, or I hope corporate leaders are pushing back against these just abrasive ideas of 60% tariffs. And my guess is that although it seems like Elon Musk is a little bit in the back pocket of President Trump right now, he's also a business person. And Tesla has huge exposure in China. And so my guess is that what we're going to see is there's a lot of talk about these 60% tariffs and a Cold War and a trade war. But that's not going to happen. Our economies are too wedded to each other.
I just heard about the tariffs also affecting Canada and Mexico. So it's not just China now. I think our neighbors are also getting taxed on tariffs.
Well, and again, I will just say, and I think I've said this in a previous episode, but I think this is just talk. I think this is just bluster and talk. And in the end, unless you have manufacturing supply lines in the United States such that tariffs raise prices and then force Americans to buy local, if you don't have those manufacturing supply lines, it doesn't mean anything. And so it just raises prices for consumers. And so my hope is that, these people are pretty good business people and this is all bluster. And so I think what we're going to see, and again, to answer your question about China, I think China is the test case. China is the one that we're going to see whether this is real or whether it's just bluster.
That's fantastic. In future episode, we love to learn more about TSMC in Phoenix since you are on the ground. So,
Well,
well,
I can't wait to talk about that, Christine. I mean, it's such an important case, and I want to wish you and our audience a really good Thanksgiving. But I can't wait to talk to you next week about TSMC and paintings.
Thank you so much. I have a wonderful holiday break. Bye bye.